She helped a lost elderly man without asking for reward, unaware he was a billionaire. When his son showed up at her workplace with a black briefcase, her supervisor's jaw dropped as he revealed. Grace Johnson's footsteps echoed through the empty hospital corridor at 11:47 p.m. Her blue uniform stuck to her back after 16 hours on her feet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she made her final rounds, checking on elderly patients one last time before her shift ended. "Mrs. Patterson, you need anything before I go?" Grace poked her head into room 412. The old woman lay still, her chest rising and falling steadily under thin hospital blankets. Grace's muscles ached as she logged her final notes at the nurse's station. Her supervisor, Ms. Martinez, walked past without acknowledging her, the same cold shoulders she'd been getting for weeks. "Hey girl, you heading out?" Tamika, another nurse aide, stopped at the desk. "You look dead on your feet." "Yeah, finally." Grace rubbed her eyes. "Double shifts done? Again? That's your third this week. You're gonna work yourself to death." Grace shrugged. Bills don't pay themselves. The subway ride to the Bronx felt endless. Grace fought to keep her eyes open as the train rattled through dark tunnels. Her phone buzzed, another text from the landlord about the late rent. She turned the screen face down. 20 years earlier flashed through her mind. Her father walking out the door with his suitcase, never looking back as 8-year-old Grace called after him. Now here she was, working herself to exhaustion to keep her mother from ending up on the street. The elevator in her building was broken again. Grace climbed 5 flights of stairs, her legs trembling. Keys jingled as she unlocked 3 deadbolts on the apartment door. "Mom, you still up?" The small living room was dark except for the glow of the TV. Her mother, Dorothy, sat wrapped in a blanket on the worn couch. Empty pill bottles lined the coffee table. "Baby, you're home late." Dorothy's voice was thin, tired. "Did you get my refills?" Grace's stomach dropped. She'd forgotten to stop at the pharmacy. "I'm sorry, Mama. I'll get them first thing tomorrow, but I needed them today." Dorothy pressed a hand to her chest. "The pain's getting worse." Grace set her bag down, guilt gnawing at her. "I know. I'm sorry. Let me heat you up some soup." In the kitchen, a white envelope caught her eye. Final notice from the landlord. Rent was 2 months behind. Grace's hands shook as she opened it. Eviction notice blazed across the top in red letters. "What's that?" Dorothy called from the living room. "Nothing, Mama. Just junk mail." Grace crumpled the notice and shoved it in her pocket. She wouldn't let her mother worry about this, too. The kitchen cupboards were nearly empty. Grace found a can of chicken soup and dumped it in a pot. Her own stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since a granola bar at lunch. But food stamps wouldn't come for another week. The soup would have to be for her mother. "Here you go, Mama." Grace brought the steaming bowl to the couch. "Careful, it's hot." Dorothy's hands trembled as she took the soup. "You're not eating?" "Had a big lunch at work." The lie came easily now. "You need to keep your strength up." Grace sat beside her mother, watching her eat slowly. The TV droned in the background. Some game show where people won more money in 30 minutes than Grace made in a year. "Why don't you ask for a raise?" Dorothy said between spoonfuls. "All those extra hours you work. They don't give raises to nurse aides, Mama. You know that. It ain't right. You work so hard." Grace squeezed her mother's thin shoulder. "Don't worry about it. We'll figure something out." Later, in her tiny bedroom, Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling. Water stains made dark patterns in the peeling paint. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. She pulled out her phone, opening the calculator app. Rent was $1,200 past due. Her mother's medications cost $340 a month. The electricity bill was overdue. Her next paycheck would barely cover half of what they needed. Grace turned on her side, curling into herself. Her stomach cramped with hunger. Outside her window, the city lights blurred as tears filled her eyes. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered into her pillow. But the only answer was the rumble of a passing train and the endless chorus of city noise beyond her walls. She thought of tomorrow, another 16-hour shift starting at 7 a.m. Her body already ached at the thought, but she had no choice. She never had a choice. Grace set her alarm for 5:30 a.m. and closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. In 5 hours, she'd do it all again. Because that's what you did when people depended on you. That's what you did when you were all someone had left. The night stretched on, filled with the soft sounds of her mother's labored breathing in the next room and the steady drip of the leaking bathroom faucet. Grace drifted in and out of restless sleep, her dreams filled with unpaid bills and empty cupboards and the long shadow of her father walking away. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to try to keep their heads above water. Another day of invisible work and silent sacrifice. Another day of hoping something would finally change. But hope was a luxury Grace couldn't afford right now. All she could do was survive. And so she would wake up in a few short hours, put on her uniform, and face another day. Because that's what survivors did. That's what she had always done. Chapter 2. Invisible. The 5:30 a.m. alarm pierced Grace's fitful sleep. Her body protested as she forced herself up, muscles stiff from yesterday's double shift. The morning routine was automatic. Splash cold water on her face. Pull on the freshly pressed blue uniform. Gulp down tap water to quiet her empty stomach. "Morning, Mama," Grace whispered, checking on her mother before leaving. Dorothy slept restlessly, her breathing raspy. The empty pill bottles on the nightstand were a silent reminder of today's urgent errand. The early morning subway car smelled of bleach and stale coffee. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool window, fighting exhaustion. At this hour, the car was filled with other workers in uniforms, maintenance staff, kitchen workers, nurse aides like her. The invisible people who kept the city running. Metropolitan Hospital loomed ahead as Grace swiped her ID card at 6:45 a.m. The morning shift nurses were already gathering for handover, their voices echoing in the sterile hallway. "Johnson, you're late." Ms. Martinez's sharp voice cut through the morning buzz. "Handover started 5 minutes ago. Sorry, the train was delayed. Save the excuses. Room 623 needs immediate attention." Mrs. Whitman had an accident. Grace bit back a response and headed for the supply closet. As she gathered clean sheets and supplies, her hands shook slightly from hunger and fatigue. Room 623 housed one of the hospital's VIP patients, Barbara Whitman, wife of some Wall Street executive. The woman lay in her private room, surrounded by fresh flowers and get-well cards. Finally, Mrs. Whitman sniffed as Grace entered. "I've been waiting forever." "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll take care of this right away." Grace worked efficiently, changing sheets and helping Mrs. Whitman clean up. The woman wrinkled her nose, turning her face away as Grace helped her onto the clean bed. "Can't they send someone else?" Mrs. Whitman muttered, loud enough for Grace to hear. "I prefer the other aide. The blonde one." Grace's face burned, but her hands remained steady. She'd heard worse. Much worse. "All done, Mrs. Whitman. Do you need anything else?" "No. Just go." In the hallway, Grace leaned against the wall for a moment, taking deep breaths. 8 more hours to go. Maybe 12, if she could pick up another extra shift. "Grace!" Tamika hurried over. "Ms. Martinez is on a warpath. She's saying you were rude to Mrs. Whitman." "What?" "I barely said 2 words to her. You know how it is. These rich folks complain, and we're always wrong." The morning dragged on. Grace changed beds, bathed patients, recorded vital signs. Her stomach growled constantly, but she ignored it. The granola bar in her pocket was for emergencies. At noon, Grace sat alone in the break room, sipping water. Around her, other staff members ate lunch, the smell of their food making her dizzy with hunger. Her phone buzzed, the landlord again. Final warning. Pay by Friday or eviction proceedings begin. Today was Wednesday. Grace closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "Johnson." Ms. Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Peterson in 415 needs assistance." "Now." Grace stood, her break barely started. "Yes, ma'am." Mr. Peterson was different from the other patients. An elderly man with kind eyes, he never complained, always said thank you. "There's my favorite nurse," he smiled as Grace entered. "You look tired, child." "I'm fine, Mr. Peterson. Let's get you sitting up for lunch." As she helped him adjust his pillows, Mr. Peterson patted her hand. "You remind me of my daughter." Same gentle touch. Grace smiled, her first genuine smile of the day. Tell me about her. She was a nurse too. Passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. His voice wavered. She worked too hard, just like you. Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed again. The landlord's number flashed on the screen. Excuse me, Mr. Peterson. I need to take this. In the hallway, Grace answered with trembling fingers. Miss Johnson, this is Mr. Reynolds. About the rent dash, please, I just need until Friday. I'm working extra shifts dash. Friday is your absolute last chance. After that, you and your mother are out. The call ended. Grace stood frozen, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Her vision blurred. Johnson! Ms. Martinez's voice made her jump. Personal calls during work hours? I'm sorry, it was urgent dash. Everything's urgent with you lately. One more incident, and we'll need to discuss your future here. The threat hung in the air as Ms. Martinez walked away. Grace checked her watch, 4:30 p.m. Just 2.5 hours until her shift ended. The evening brought a fresh wave of tasks. Grace moved through them mechanically, her body on autopilot. Change Mrs. Cooper's 4. Help Mr. Rodriguez to the bathroom. Record Mrs. Lee's blood pressure. At 7 p.m., Grace clocked out. The night shift workers were arriving, looking fresh and alert. She envied their energy. Outside, Manhattan's winter wind cut through her thin coat. The streets were dark, crowds hurrying past on their way home. Grace waited for the subway, shivering on the platform. A commotion near the station entrance caught her attention. An elderly man in expensive but rumpled clothes stood looking confused, no coat despite the cold. Excuse me, he called to passing strangers. I can't seem to find. I think I'm lost. People rushed past, avoiding eye contact. The man's distress was visible, his hands shaking as he patted his pockets. Grace looked at her watch. She needed to get home, check on her mother, pick up those medications. But something in the man's lost expression tugged at her. She took a step toward him, then another. The subway rattled into the station behind her, but she barely noticed. The old man looked up as she approached, relief flooding his face. Can you help me? He asked, his voice cultured but trembling. I can't remember where I live. And in that moment, despite her exhaustion and hunger and worries, Grace made a choice that would change everything. The subway platform was nearly empty now. Grace approached the elderly man slowly, her nursing instincts taking over despite her exhaustion. Sir, I'm a nurse aide. Can I help you? He wore an expensive cashmere sweater and leather shoes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His silver hair was disheveled, and his eyes held that familiar, lost look she'd seen too many times before. I was going to the park, he said, his voice uncertain. But now I can't remember which park. Or how to get home. Grace moved closer, noting his trembling hands and confused expression. I'm Grace. What's your name, sir? Richard. Richard Thompson. He frowned. At least, I'm quite sure that's my name. The name tickled something in Grace's memory. She'd heard it somewhere before, maybe in the news or at the hospital. Mr. Thompson, you're shivering. Where's your coat? He looked down at himself, surprised. I must have left it. Somewhere. The scene transported Grace back 5 years. Her grandmother, standing in their kitchen at 3 a.m., trying to make coffee while wearing her nightgown backwards. The same lost expression, the same confusion. Early onset Alzheimer's, the doctors had said. 3 months later, her grandmother was gone. Mr. Thompson, do you have any identification with you? A wallet, maybe? He patted his pockets frantically. Yes, somewhere. Grace helped him check his pockets, finally locating a worn leather wallet in his back pocket. Inside, she found a driver's license with an Upper East Side address. Park Avenue, she read. Is that where you live, Mr. Thompson? Park Avenue? Yes, that sounds right. My son lives there too. Grace checked her phone. 7:45 p.m. Her mother would be wondering where she was. The pharmacy would be closing soon. Sir, let me help you get home. It's not safe for you to be out alone this late. Home? He repeated the word like it was foreign. Yes, please. I feel very tired. Grace hailed a taxi, something she never did herself, too expensive. But Mr. Thompson needed to get home safely. Park Avenue, Please, she told the driver, showing him the address. During the ride, Mr. Thompson stared out the window, occasionally muttering to himself. Grace watched him carefully, noting symptoms she'd seen in patients at the hospital. My wife loved the park, he said suddenly. We used to walk there every morning. Before his voice trailed off, tears welling in his eyes. It's okay, Mr. Thompson. We're almost home. The taxi pulled up to a luxury apartment building with a uniformed doorman. Grace helped Mr. Thompson out of the car. Mrs. Thompson, the doorman rushed forward. We've been looking everywhere for Mr. Thompson. The family's called the police. I found him at the subway station near Metropolitan Hospital, Grace explained. He seemed disoriented. Thank God you found him. The son's been frantic. Please come up. I want to thank you. Grace shook her head. I really need to get home, but Mr. Thompson gripped her hand. Please, stay. I don't want to be alone. The elevator was bigger than Grace's bedroom. Mirror-polished brass reflected their images. Mr. Thompson in his expensive clothes, Grace in her wrinkled uniform, dark circles under her eyes. The apartment door opened before they reached it. A tall man in his 40s rushed out. Dad, where have you been? We've been worried sick. Behind him, an elegant woman in designer clothes appeared. Richard, darling. Thank heavens. Mr. Thompson looked confused again. Marcus? Is that you? Yes, Dad, it's me. Come inside. The son, Marcus Thompson, turned to Grace. You found him? At the subway station. He seemed lost, so I helped him home. Marcus Thompson studied her hospital uniform. You're a nurse? Nurse aide at Metropolitan. Please come in. We need to understand what happened. The apartment was larger than Grace's entire building. Original paintings hung on silk-covered walls. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. They sat in a living room bigger than Grace's apartment. Mr. Thompson sank into a leather armchair, already half asleep. He was trying to find a park, Grace explained. He mentioned his wife. Mom died 6 months ago, Marcus said quietly. Dad's been different since then. We hired a live-in caregiver, but she quit last week. Said he was too difficult to handle. He shows signs of Alzheimer's, Grace said carefully. The confusion, the wandering. We know. The doctors diagnosed him 2 months ago. Marcus ran a hand through his hair. We've been trying to find a good care facility, but no facility. Mr. Thompson suddenly spoke up. Want to stay home? Dad, we've discussed this. You need proper care, no. Your mother loved this house. Can't leave. Grace watched the interaction, remembering similar arguments with her own grandmother. The fear in their eyes when they realized they were losing control of their lives. Mr. Thompson, she said gently, what if someone came here to help? So you could stay home? He looked at her hopefully. Like you? You're kind. Like Sarah was. Sarah? Grace asked. My mother, Marcus explained. Dad seems to respond well to you. We've had 5 different caregivers this month, but he's never been this calm with any of them. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Where are you? Need my medicine. Reality crashed back. She stood quickly. I really need to go. My mother's waiting, Of course, Marcus said. Let me call you a car. And please, we need to compensate you, No need. I just wanted to help. At least take my card. We're still looking for a permanent caregiver. Grace took the business card automatically, her mind already on the pharmacy, wondering if she could convince them to stay open a few minutes late. As she left, Mr. Thompson called after her. Come back soon. Please. In the elevator, Grace looked at the card. Marcus Thompson, CEO, Thompson Global Investments. Now she remembered where she'd heard the name. The Thompsons were billionaires, their name often in the news. Outside, a sleek black car waited to take her home. Grace sank into the soft leather seats, her body finally registering the day's exhaustion. Her phone buzzed again. The pharmacy. Closing in 10 minutes. Unable to hold prescriptions, Grace closed her eyes. One crisis averted, another waiting at home. But for now, in this moment between moments, she let herself rest. The car glided through Manhattan's glittering streets toward the Bronx, carrying her back to her reality of unpaid bills and empty cupboards. But something had changed tonight. She just didn't know it yet. Grace arrived at Metropolitan Hospital the next morning to find Tamika waiting by the time clock. Girl, why didn't you tell me? Tamika grabbed her arm. The Thompsons? For real? Grace's stomach dropped. How did you dash? It's all over the morning news. Missing billionaire found by hospital worker. They got security camera footage of you helping him into that fancy building. Grace swiped her card, watching the clock tick to 6:59 a.m. I was just doing my job. Your job? Tamika followed her to the locker room. You found Richard Thompson. The Richard Thompson. Tell me you at least got a reward. No. And I didn't want one. Grace pulled on her scrubs. Her stomach growled. She'd skipped breakfast again after using her last dollars on her mother's medication last night. You're crazy. These people probably spend more on lunch than we make in a month. Other nurses gathered around as Grace tried to organize her supplies for morning rounds. Is it true? Lisa from pediatrics leaned in. They say he's worth billions. Did they offer you a job? Are they really putting him in some fancy nursing home? Grace shut her locker harder than necessary. I need to start my rounds. She pushed past the crowd, but their whispers followed her down the hall. At the nurse's station, Ms. Martinez stood waiting, arms crossed. Johnson. My office. Now. The supervisor's office was small and windowless. Ms. Martinez sat behind her desk, reading something on her computer screen. Care to explain why you didn't report finding a confused elderly patient yesterday? He wasn't our patient, Dash. Richard Thompson was released from Evergreen Care Center last week. They're one of our partner facilities. You should have brought him here for evaluation. Grace straightened in her chair. He had ID. I took him home to his family. After spending quite a while in their apartment, according to the news, Ms. Martinez's eyes narrowed. Were you looking for some kind of opportunity? Excuse me? These are wealthy people, Johnson. Vulnerable, wealthy people. It doesn't look good when our staff dash. I helped a lost old man get home safely. That's all. A knock interrupted them. A man in a suit stood in the doorway. Hospital administration. Ms. Johnson? The CEO would like to see you. Grace had never been to the executive floor. Everything was glass and chrome, a world away from the linoleum floors of her usual domain. Hospital CEO Dr. Richards sat behind a mahogany desk. Another man stood by the window, Marcus Thompson. Miss Johnson. Dr. Richards gestured to a chair. Mr. Thompson here has been telling me about your assistance yesterday. Grace sat stiffly, aware of her wrinkled uniform. I just did what anyone would do. Not anyone, Marcus Thompson said. 5 people walked past my father before you stopped. We checked the security footage. Dr. Richards cleared his throat. The Thompson family has been very generous to this hospital over the years. We're grateful you represented us so well. Actually, Marcus stepped forward. That's why I'm here. We'd like to discuss a private care arrangement for my father. Grace's heart jumped. The salary for private nursing would be. Unfortunately, Dr. Richards cut in. Hospital policy prohibits staff from accepting private employment from patients or their families. I'm sure we could work something out, Marcus said. Compensation wouldn't be an issue. It's not about money. It's about professional boundaries. Grace sat silently as they discussed her future. Outside the window, Manhattan stretched away, all glass towers and privilege. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably her mother, wondering why she hadn't answered her morning call. Miss Johnson. She realized they were waiting for her response. I'm sorry, but I need to get back to my patients. In the hallway, Tamika grabbed her again. The Thompson guy is here? Girl, tell me you're taking whatever they're offering. I can't. Hospital policy. Policy? Since when do you care about Dash? Tamika stopped, staring past Grace. Oh. Drama alert. A well-dressed woman was arguing with the charge nurse. Grace recognized her, the director from Evergreen Care Center. We demand to know who spread these allegations, the woman was saying. Our facility provides excellent care. Dash. Grace turned away quickly, but not before the woman spotted her. You're the one who found Mr. Thompson. Did you put these ideas in his son's head about negligence? I don't know what you're talking about. Our reputation is being questioned because a confused old man wandered off. If anyone encouraged his family to make accusations, Dash. Is there a problem here? Ms. Martinez appeared, eyes sharp. No problem. Grace walked away, her hands shaking. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of whispers and stares. Even her regular patients seemed different. "Saw you on the news," Mr. Peterson said during his afternoon check. "My daughter called to tell me. Said you're a hero." "I'm not. I just helped someone who was lost. Sometimes that's all it takes to be a hero." At lunch, Grace sat alone in the stairwell, Marcus Thompson's business card burning a hole in her pocket. The salary he'd mentioned would solve all their problems. No more missed meals. No more choosing between rent and medication. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. "Miss Johnson," a woman's voice. "This is Barbara Chun from the State Health Department. We're investigating complaints about Evergreen Care Center. Would you be willing to make a statement about Mr. Thompson's condition when you found him?" Grace's mouth went dry. I need to think about it. Of course. But please understand, if you witnessed any negligence, you have a duty to report it." The call ended. Grace leaned against the cold stairwell wall. Through the window, she could see the Evergreen Care Center building a few blocks away. How many other patients were there, confused and scared like Mr. Thompson had been? But reporting them could cost her everything. Ms. Martinez was already looking for reasons to fire her. Her phone buzzed again. Her mother. "Baby, you coming home soon?" "I'm not feeling so good." Grace checked her watch. 3 hours left in her shift. "Unless..." "Johnson." Ms. Martinez's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Room 415 needs attention. Now." Grace stood, tucking the business card deeper into her pocket. One crisis at a time. That's all she could handle right now. But as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Thompson's confused eyes, his trembling hands. How many others were there, invisible and suffering? The weight of that question would follow her through the rest of her shift, through the subway ride home, through another night of worrying about bills and choices and consequences. Sometimes doing the right thing meant risking everything. The question was, could she afford to be right? The coughing woke Grace at 3 a.m. Harsh, racking coughs from her mother's room. "Mama!" Grace rushed in, flipping on the light. Dorothy sat hunched over in bed, struggling to breathe. "Can't catch my breath," Dorothy gasped between coughs. Grace grabbed the inhaler from the nightstand. "Here, Mama. Small breaths." The medication helped, but Dorothy's breathing remained labored. Grace pressed a hand to her mother's forehead. "You're burning up." "It's nothing. Just a cold." "This isn't just a cold." Grace checked her mother's pulse. Rapid and thready. "We need to get you to the hospital." "No hospitals. Can't afford it." "Mama, please dash." A heavy knock at the front door made them both jump. Grace checked the time. 3:17 a.m. Through the peephole, she saw Mr. Reynolds, their landlord, with 2 other men. "Miss Johnson, open up." Grace's hands shook as she unlocked the door. Mr. Reynolds pushed past her, papers in hand. "This is your final warning. Pay the full amount by noon today, or we start eviction proceedings." "Please, my mother's sick dash. Not my problem." He slapped the papers on the table. "Noon, Miss Johnson. After that, we change the locks." After they left, Grace sat at the kitchen table, head in her hands. The eviction notice stared up at her. $2,400 due. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from Marcus Thompson. A text message, "Please reconsider our offer. Salary starting at $85,000 plus benefits." Dorothy's coughing echoed from the bedroom. Grace arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m., eyes burning from lack of sleep. Tamika took one look at her and pulled her aside. "You look awful. What's wrong?" Before Grace could answer, Ms. Martinez appeared. "Johnson." A word. In her office, Ms. Martinez wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit sat waiting. "This is Mr. Parker from Evergreen Care Center's legal department." The man smiled thinly. "Miss Johnson, we understand you've been contacted by state investigators." Grace's throat went dry. "I haven't told them anything." "Good. Let's keep it that way." He placed an envelope on the desk. "The care center is prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience." Grace stared at the envelope. "Are you trying to bribe me?" "We're offering fair compensation for your time and discretion." $20,000. $20,000. Enough for the rent, her mother's medical bills, maybe even a better apartment. All you need to do is sign this statement saying you observed nothing unusual when you encountered Mr. Thompson. Grace picked up the envelope. It felt heavy with possibility. Her phone buzzed. The hospital's ER. Miss Johnson? Your mother was just brought in by ambulance. Grace dropped the envelope. What? Severe respiratory distress. She's asking for you. Grace ran to the ER, heart pounding. Dorothy lay on a gurney, oxygen mask covering her face. Pneumonia, the doctor explained. She needs to be admitted. Do you have insurance? No, but without insurance, we can only stabilize her and release I'm a hospital employee. Even with the employee discount, intensive care costs Grace's phone buzzed again. Marcus Thompson. She stepped into the hallway to answer. Miss Johnson? I've just heard about your mother. Please let us help. The position is still open, full benefits starting immediately. Grace leaned against the wall, legs weak. Through the ER doors, she could see her mother struggling to breathe. Mr. Parker's envelope lay abandoned on Ms. Martinez's desk. $20,000. A way out. But at what cost? Grace walked slowly back to Ms. Martinez's office. The envelope sat untouched. Have you made your decision? Mr. Parker asked. Grace picked up the envelope. Inside, she saw the statement she was supposed to sign. I observed no signs of negligence or mistreatment. Her hands trembled as she remembered Mr. Thompson, confused and alone in the cold. How many others like him were still at Evergreen? A text lit up her phone from the state investigator. Multiple families have come forward. Need your statement to build the case. Grace set the envelope down. I can't sign this. Miss Johnson, Mr. Parker's voice hardened. Consider your position carefully. I have. Grace stood. And I won't lie about what I saw. You're making a serious mistake. In the hallway, Grace's phone rang again. Marcus Thompson. I heard Evergreen approached you, he said without preamble. Don't take their money? I didn't. Good. Because we're filing a lawsuit. Multiple families are joining us. We need your testimony. Grace watched through the window as doctors worked on her mother. If I help you, she said slowly, I could lose my job. Then let me help you. The care position is still open. Full benefits, starting today. Your mother would be fully covered. Grace closed her eyes. Why are you doing this? Because my father talks about you. Says you have kind eyes like my mother did. He trusts you. A pause. And because someone needs to stop them. Through the window, Grace saw Mr. Parker leaving Ms. Martinez's office, phone to his ear. Her mother's doctor approached. Miss Johnson, we need to discuss payment arrangements. Grace straightened her shoulders. Actually, I need to fill out some insurance paperwork. My new job starts today. The doctor looked confused. New job? Yes. Grace took out her phone to call Marcus back. And I have some information about Evergreen Care Center that people need to hear. Sometimes the right choice was the hardest one. But as Grace watched her mother's breathing ease under proper medical care, she knew she'd chosen correctly. The storm was coming. She could lose everything, her job, her reputation, maybe even her home, but she couldn't lose herself. Not for any price. Grace sat at her mother's hospital bedside, laptop balanced on her knees. The cursor blinked at the top of a blank document. Official statement, Evergreen Care Center investigation. Dorothy slept peacefully, her breathing finally stable after 3 days of intensive treatment. The private room, courtesy of the Thompson family's influence, was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. You should rest, Tamika said, bringing Grace a cup of coffee. You've been here for 20 hours straight. I need to finish this statement. Grace took a sip of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. The investigator needs it by morning. Girl, you're really doing this? Going against Evergreen? Grace opened a folder of photos on her laptop. Pictures she'd taken during her visits to Evergreen over the past 3 days. Empty nurses' stations. Medication logs with suspicious gaps. Patients left unattended in hallways. Someone has to stop them. Her phone lit up with a text from Marcus Thompson. Dad's asking for you. Can you stop by after you finish the report? The past 3 days had been a blur. After accepting the Thompsons' job offer, Grace had split her time between her mother's hospital room and gathering evidence against Evergreen. The care center's administration had barred her from entering, but other families had let her in as their guest. What she'd seen had made her sick. Remember Mrs. Chonin 204? A nurse had whispered to her yesterday. They forgot to feed her for 2 days. Just forgot. Grace started typing. On the evening of January 15th, 2025, I encountered Richard Thompson. Her phone buzzed. A block number. She ignored it. Since word got out about her involvement in the investigation, she'd received dozens of threatening calls. "They'll destroy you," one caller had warned. "No hospital in the city will hire you after this." The door opened. Ms. Martinez stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Johnson." A word. In the hallway, her former supervisor shifted nervously. "The hospital board is concerned about your involvement in this investigation. I'm not employed by Metropolitan anymore." "No, but your actions could impact our relationship with Evergreen. They're threatening to end our transfer partnership. Maybe you should be asking why they're so worried about what I'll say." Ms. Martinez lowered her voice. "They're offering to double the money. 40,000, plus guaranteed employment at any facility you choose." Grace turned back to her mother's room. "Not interested. Think about your future. Your mother's care isn't free, even with your new job's insurance." "My future?" Grace's voice rose. "What about Mrs. Chen's future? Or Mr. Thompson's? Or all the other patients they've neglected?" A few doors down, an elderly man appeared in a doorway. "I remember you," he said. "You used to bring me extra blankets." Grace recognized him. "A former Evergreen patient transferred to Metropolitan last week." "Mr. Davis? How are you feeling?" "Better. Here they remember my medicine." His eyes clouded. "At the other place, sometimes they forgot for days. Would you be willing to make a statement about that?" Grace asked softly. He nodded. "I'm not afraid anymore." Back in her mother's room, Grace added Mr. Davis's account to her report. The document was now 10 pages long, filled with dates, times, witness statements. Her phone buzzed again. The state investigator. "Miss Johnson? We've received copies of Evergreen's internal documents. Someone leaked them anonymously. It's worse than we thought." Grace's hands stilled on the keyboard. "How much worse?" "Deaths, Miss Johnson. Preventable deaths they covered up." The room seemed to spin. Grace gripped the edge of her chair. "I'll have the report to you in an hour." She worked steadily, detailing everything she'd seen and heard. Every neglected patient, every falsified record, every cry for help ignored. Dorothy stirred in her sleep. "Grace? That you, baby?" "I'm here, Mama." Grace took her mother's hand. "How you feeling?" "Better. These doctors, they really listen." Dorothy squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing, baby. Standing up to those people." Grace's phone lit up with another text from Marcus. "Dad's agitated. Keeps asking for you." "Go on," Dorothy said. "I'll be fine here." The Thompsons' Park Avenue apartment was dark when Grace arrived. Only Richard Thompson sat awake, staring out at the city lights. "Sarah?" He turned as Grace entered. "No." "Grace. You came." "Of course I came, Mr. Thompson. They hurt people there." His voice was clearer than she'd heard it in days. "At that place. I remember. They hurt people." Grace sat beside him. "I know, but they won't hurt anyone else. We're stopping them." "Good." Sarah would be proud. She always helped people too. Grace took out her laptop. "Mr. Thompson, would you like to tell me what you remember?" "For the report?" He talked for an hour. Despite his confusion about other things, his memories of Evergreen were crystal clear. Back in her mother's hospital room, Grace added his testimony to the report. The sun was rising by the time she finished. Her finger hovered over the send button. Once she submitted this, there would be no going back. Her phone buzzed one last time, another threat from a block number. Grace thought of Mr. Davis, finally unafraid to speak. Of Mr. Thompson, trusting her with his story. Of her mother, breathing easily at last. She hit send. The report was gone. 30 pages of truth launched into the world like a missile. Grace leaned back in her chair, suddenly exhausted. Through the window, she watched the sun rise over Manhattan, painting the buildings gold. Her mother stirred. "Did you do it?" "Yes, Mama. It's done. Good girl." Dorothy's eyes were proud. "You always were the brave one." Grace's phone lit up, the state investigator again. "We received it. Miss Johnson, this is going to change everything." Grace looked out at the rising sun. Change was coming, ready or not. She was ready. The morning news hit like a bomb. Evergreen Care Center investigation reveals systemic abuse. Grace watched the headline scroll across the waiting room TV, her stomach in knots. Sources say a former Metropolitan Hospital employee provided crucial evidence. The reporter's voice filled the quiet hospital corridor. Dorothy was being discharged today. Grace gathered her mother's belongings while trying to ignore the stares from passing hospital staff. "You're all over the news," Tamika whispered, slipping into the room. "The FBI just showed up at Evergreen. They're seizing records." Grace's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Reporters, investigators, more whistleblowers coming forward. "Miss Johnson," a man in a dark suit appeared in the doorway. "I'm Agent Roberts, FBI. We need to talk." The hospital provided an empty conference room. Grace sat across from two agents, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Your report was very thorough," Agent Roberts said. "But we need you to walk us through everything again. From the beginning." Grace talked for hours. She described finding Mr. Thompson, the signs of neglect she'd documented, the threats, the bribes. "They offered you $40,000 to stay quiet." "Yes." Through Ms. Martinez at Metropolitan, the agents exchanged looks. "We'll need to speak with her." A knock interrupted them. Dr. Richards, the hospital CEO, stood in the doorway, looking grave. "Miss Johnson, the board would like to speak with you." The boardroom was packed. Hospital administrators, lawyers, even Marcus Thompson sat at the long table. "Miss Johnson," the board chairman began, "your actions have placed this hospital in a difficult position." "My actions?" Grace's voice shook. "What about Evergreen's actions?" "Our partnership with Evergreen represented millions in annual revenue dash, while they killed people through neglect." Marcus Thompson stood. "If I may, Thompson Global has been this hospital's largest donor for 20 years. We fully support Miss Johnson's actions. In fact, we're prepared to double our annual contribution, provided the hospital implements her recommended changes to patient care protocols." The room erupted in whispers. Dr. Richards cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson, we owe you an apology. And a job offer." Grace blinked. "What?" "We're creating a new position, patient care advocate, full authority to investigate and report any concerns about patient treatment. The salary is substantial." "I already have a job." Grace looked at Marcus. "But thank you." Back in her mother's room, Dorothy was dressed and ready to leave. "Where are we going, baby?" she asked. "The apartment." "We're not going back there." Grace helped her mother into a wheelchair. "We have a new place, somewhere better." The Thompsons' driver waited with their car. As they pulled away from the hospital, Grace's phone buzzed with a news alert. Evergreen CEO arrested. More facilities under investigation. "You did that," Dorothy said proudly. "My baby girl did that." They drove to a new apartment building in a quieter part of the Bronx. Clean hallways, working elevator, a doorman who smiled as he helped with Dorothy's wheelchair. "Second floor," Grace told her mother. "No more stairs." The apartment was small but bright. New furniture, fresh paint, a hospital bed by the window for Dorothy's recovery. "How can we afford this?" Dorothy whispered. "My new job pays well, Mama." "Really well?" Grace's phone buzzed. A text from the state investigator, more families coming forward. 3 more facilities under investigation. "Need your help." Another message came through from Ms. Martinez. "They arrested our CFO. Said he took kickbacks from Evergreen." "I should have listened to you." The TV in their new living room showed footage of police at Evergreen. Former employees being let out in handcuffs. Families hugging and crying. "Miss Johnson," the doorman called up. "There's a Mr. Davis here to see you." The elderly man from the hospital stood in the lobby, leaning on his cane. "Had to thank you," he said. "My daughter's moving me to a new facility. A good one. Because of what you did." Grace helped him to a chair. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Sleeping better, too. No more nightmares about that place." More messages flooded Grace's phone. Other healthcare workers wanting to report abuse. Families seeking advice. Lawyers requesting statements. "You should write a book," Tamika said when she visited that evening. "Tell the whole story." Grace watched her mother sleeping peacefully in the new hospital bed. The story's not over yet. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus Thompson, Dad's asking for you. Says he remembers more. Things we need to know." Grace looked at the pile of messages waiting for her response. More facilities. More patients needing help. More battles to fight. Tell him I'll be there tomorrow, she texted back. Dorothy stirred. You going back to work already? Yes, Mama. There's more work to do. My brave girl. Dorothy smiled. Just like your daddy before he changed. Grace froze. What? He was a whistleblower too, baby. Reported safety violations at his company. Dorothy's eyes grew distant. Lost everything. That's why he left. Couldn't face us after that. Grace sat heavily on the couch. All these years, she'd thought. Her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Nationwide investigation into elder care facilities launched. Outside their window, the city lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere out there, more people needed help. More truth needed telling. Grace opened her laptop and began to type. To the State Health Department Investigation Committee. I have new information about 3 additional facilities. The night stretched ahead, full of work to be done. But for the first time in years, Grace wasn't tired. She was ready. And you're sure about these numbers? Grace asked, studying the documents spread across her new office desk. Positive, Agent Roberts replied. 16 facilities in the same ownership network as Evergreen, all showing similar patterns. 1 month had passed since her report went public. Grace's small office in the Thompson building had become a command center for the expanding investigation. Her phone buzzed. Tamika, turn on Channel 4. Now, Grace flipped on the wall-mounted TV. The Evergreen CEO stood outside the courthouse in handcuffs. With today's indictment, the total number of charges reaches 47 counts. The reporter announced. A knock at her door interrupted. Marcus Thompson entered, looking tired but satisfied. They're offering a plea deal, he said. Full confession in exchange for a lighter sentence. Will they name names? Other facilities? That's part of the deal. Marcus sat heavily. Dad's testimony really shook them. When a billionaire describes being neglected, Grace's desk phone lit up. Her direct line had been ringing constantly since the news broke. Miss Johnson, a trembling voice. My mother's in Cedar Grove Care Center. I think something's wrong. I'll be there in an hour, Grace promised. Her new job title was Senior Patient Advocate at the Thompson Family Foundation. But really, she was a firefighter, rushing from crisis to crisis, gathering evidence, giving testimony. The car's ready, Marcus's assistant reminded her. And you have the state senate hearing at 4? Grace grabbed her coat. Call Mr. Peterson at Metropolitan. Tell him I'll stop by this evening. The old man had become her eyes and ears at the hospital, reporting any concerns about patient care. At Cedar Grove, Grace found conditions familiar from Evergreen: understaffing, missing medications, falsified records. They said Mom was uncooperative when she complained, the woman who'd called said. Threatened to discharge her. Grace took photos, made notes. Another facility for the growing investigation. Her phone buzzed her mother. Baby? You coming home for dinner? Got the Senate hearing, Mama. Save me a plate? Dorothy's health had improved dramatically in their new apartment. Regular medication, good food, less stress. Amazing what money could do. The Senate hearing room was packed. Grace sat before a panel of stern-faced politicians, cameras flashing. Miss Johnson, please describe what you witnessed at Evergreen Care Center. She told the story again. Finding Mr. Thompson. The evidence of neglect. The attempted bribes. And why did you choose to come forward? Grace thought of her father, of his choice to speak up, to lose everything for the truth. Because it was right, she said simply. Someone had to. After the hearing, reporters swarmed. Miss Johnson, is it true more arrests are coming? Any comment on the class action lawsuit? Grace pushed through to her waiting car. Inside, another text from Marcus. Dad's asking for you. Good day today. At the Thompsons' apartment, Richard sat in his usual chair by the window. His condition had stabilized under proper care. Grace. His smile was bright. Sarah, look who's here. He still confused her with his late wife sometimes. Grace didn't mind. How are you feeling, Mr. Thompson? Better. The new nurse you hired. She remembers my stories. Grace sat with him, listening to tales of his younger days. His mind drifted, but his spirit was stronger. Her phone buzzed. Agent Roberts, Cedar Grove raid scheduled for morning. Need you there? Another facility. Another fight. At home that night, Grace found Dorothy waiting up. Saw you on TV, baby. You look strong. I was scared, Mama. Being brave isn't about not being scared. Dorothy squeezed her hand. Your daddy was scared too. When he spoke up, tell me about him. The real story. Dorothy's eyes grew distant. He reported safety violations at the construction company. People were dying because they cut corners. He had proof. What happened? They destroyed him, blacklisted him from every job in the city. We lost everything. Dorothy sighed. He thought leaving would protect us from the fallout. Grace's phone lit up. Another news alert. Healthcare watchdog group launches nationwide hotline for reporting elder abuse. You did what he couldn't, Dorothy said softly. You stood your ground. Grace opened her laptop, adding Cedar Grove's details to her growing database of facilities under investigation. A new email popped up from Metropolitan Hospital's board. Following your testimony, we've implemented new oversight protocols. Would you consider consulting on their development? Another message from Marcus. Thompson Foundation expanding investigation fund to $50 million. Need your input on distribution. And from Tamika, girl, they're calling you the healthcare angel on social media. You're trending. Grace closed her laptop. Through her window, she could see the lights of the city. Thousands of buildings, thousands of stories. How many more evergreens were out there? How many more people needed someone to speak up? Her father had tried, had lost everything, but he'd shown her the way. You okay, baby? Dorothy asked. Yeah, Mama? Grace smiled. Just thinking about tomorrow. Because tomorrow meant another facility to investigate. Another truth to uncover. Another chance to make things right. She was her father's daughter after all. 6 months had passed since the Evergreen report. Grace stood in front of Metropolitan Hospital, staring up at the familiar building. The morning sun caught the new sign being installed. Thompson Johnson Center for Elder Care Excellence. Still can't believe they named it after you, Tamika said, joining her on the sidewalk. After my father, actually, Grace touched the sign's base. James Johnson. Finally found him last month. The construction crew worked steadily, transforming the hospital's old East Wing into a state-of-the-art care facility. Miss Johnson, Ms. Martinez approached, looking different in her new role as patient care coordinator. The inspection team is ready. Inside, the renovation was nearly complete. Grace walked through bright hallways with her tablet, checking each detail against strict new protocols. All rooms have monitoring systems? She asked the head nurse. Yes. Direct links to the nurse's station. No more unattended patients. Her phone buzzed. Dorothy, don't forget dinner tonight. Your father's nervous about seeing everyone. Finding James Johnson hadn't been easy. After losing everything, he'd moved to Chicago, working odd jobs under a different name. But the publicity around Grace's whistleblowing had reached him. I saw you on the news, he'd said in that first phone call, his voice breaking. You did what I couldn't. Now he was back in New York, helping the Thompson Foundation identify unsafe working conditions in their construction projects. Grace's office phone rang. Agent Roberts with an update. Final sentencing for Evergreen CEO. 20 years. No chance of parole. Good. Grace made a note. Any word on the Cedar Grove appeal? Denied. They're done. In 6 months, the investigation had expanded to 37 facilities across 12 states. Over 200 arrests. Thousands of patients moved to better care. Miss Johnson, a young nurse aide, stopped her. Can I show you something? In room 415, Mr. Peterson's old room, an elderly woman sat by the window. Tell her, the aide encouraged. I was at Evergreen, the woman said softly. In the bad times? Now I'm here because of you. Grace sat with her, listening to another story of neglect and recovery. Her tablet filled with notes. Always more work to do. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Thompson. Dad's having a good day. Wants to see the new facility. At 93, Richard Thompson still had his difficult moments. But under proper care, he'd stabilized. Even remembered things more clearly. Grace. He beamed as she entered his apartment. Sarah, look who's here. It's Grace, Dad. Marcus reminded gently. I know. Richard winked at Grace. I just like remembering Sarah, too. They took him to tour the new facility. He moved slowly with his walker, examining everything. This is good, he said firmly. This is right. Back in her office, Grace found more messages waiting. From the state health department, new legislation drafted. Need your testimony next week. From Metropolitan's board, funding approved for 3 more facilities. From Tamika, girl, check your email. You're not going to believe this. The email was from Columbia University Medical School. Dear Ms. Johnson, we are pleased to offer you a full scholarship. Grace sat back, stunned. She'd mentioned wanting to become a doctor, but never thought. Her phone rang. Her father. Baby girl, you coming to dinner? Your mama's making my favorite. On my way, Daddy. She gathered her things, pausing at her office window. The city spread out below, lights twinkling on as evening fell. Somewhere out there, another nurse aide was working a double shift. Another patient needed help. Another truth waited to be told. But tonight was for family. At their new house in Queens, big enough for all of them now, Dorothy had set the table with her best dishes. My children, she said, tears in her eyes as Grace and James walked in. Both my fighters. They sat together, passing dishes, sharing stories. James talked about his new work with the foundation. Dorothy showed off her garden plans for spring. Grace's phone buzzed one last time. A news alert. Nationwide elder care reform bill passes. Thompson-Johnson Act to set new standards. Look at that, James said proudly. My daughter's name on a law. Our name, Grace corrected. I learned from you, Daddy. Later, they sat on the porch, watching stars appear over Queens. Tomorrow meant more work, more facilities to check, more battles to fight. But tonight, Grace Johnson sat with her family, mother, father. All the broken pieces finally mended and felt peace. Her phone lay silent. The city hummed distantly. And in hospitals across America, changes were coming. Better care, better oversight, better chances for the forgotten ones. Because one person had chosen to speak up. Because an invisible worker had chosen to be seen. Because Grace Johnson, daughter of a whistleblower, had chosen to finish what her father started. And somewhere in Manhattan, in a newly renovated hospital room, another patient slept safely, knowing someone was watching out for them. Someone would speak up. Someone would make it right. And in the morning, Grace would be there to make sure of it. Because that's what fighters did. That's what Johnsons did. That's what love of family, of truth, of doing right, had taught her to do.